Being young, not so bad. We're not paying the electric bill, or doing our taxes, or choosing an insurance plan. We have summer break, winter break, spring break. Basically, all the breaks. On the other hand, being young is frustrating. We can feel like we're not ready, that we don't have a choice, that we don't have a voice. It seems like we're in a holding pattern, but we don't have to wait for the next stage of life to make a change, to make a difference. Because even though we are next, we are now. We are young.
Have you ever been around an older person who talks about what it's like to be young? They reminisce about the music they listened to, the lack of responsibility they had, and the freedom they experienced. They talk about their glory days on the football team, or the epic pranks they pulled, or the amazing friends they had. There's always a sense of nostalgia people have about being young. And some of that nostalgia is true. Being the age you are now is pretty great. You don't have to worry about making a living or paying your bills. You're developing friends that in many cases you'll keep for the rest of your lives. You have freedom to pursue your interests, whether it's sports or bands or clubs. You're figuring out who you are and who you want without the pressure of having to know right away. When you're in high school, if you want to go to dinner and a movie, some of you just have to ask for money from your parents, and they give it to you. When you're an adult, you have to pick. Do I spend money for dinner or a movie? When you live at home and you're sick, your mom makes you chicken noodle soup and gives you control of the TV for the whole day, catering to your every need. When you're an adult, you make your own soup and wish someone were around to take care of you. When you're a student and you want some time away from classes and stress, you think, no worries, I have 3 months off in the summer. When you're an adult, you have 2 weeks off from work during the whole year. So there's that. The point is, even though it doesn't seem like it, being a student isn't all that terrible. On the other hand, you probably don't need me to tell you that there are disadvantages to being in that stage of life. So you have to get up early, stay awake no matter how boring the class is, ask permission to go to the bathroom, and eat lunch in a cafeteria that's not all that different from a prison dining hall. And on top of that, you have to take physics and chemistry and biology, even if you know that there's no chance that you'll ever need them. Hey, I get it. Being young isn't a walk in the park. But there are other reasons why being young is hard too. And these reasons we may not say out loud or even admit to ourselves. Being a student is hard because you get the feeling no one is listening to you. Adults don't take you as seriously. You feel like you have to prove yourself to everyone who's older than you. You also feel like what you have to say really doesn't matter. But what could you say that's important to an adult? You also get the feeling that older people just look down on you. Maybe you've heard people say things like teenagers these days or these millennials, and it's never followed by something good. And what's crazy is this doesn't just happen at school. I'm guessing when your family makes certain decisions, that some of you feel pushed to the side like you're not grown up enough to have something useful to say. And if you have a job or you volunteer with older people, it happens there too. Maybe it even happens at church. Maybe one of the hardest parts of being young is feeling like you don't count yet, like you can't be heard or respected or even helpful until you're older. And it's tough because deep down, something in you probably feels like that shouldn't be true, and there's something wrong with that system. But what can you do about it? Well, for the next couple weeks, that's what we're going to talk about. To start, we're going to look at a book in the Bible called 1 Timothy. Some of you have probably heard of the Apostle Paul. He's the guy responsible for the growth of Christianity in the first century. He dedicated his entire life and ultimately lost his life for the cause of Jesus. He was what we might consider a type A personality today. Super driven, super motivated, great work ethic, and a go-getter. And he used that passion and that drive to talk about Jesus whenever he could. Now, Paul was a mentor to Timothy, almost like a dad to him. Timothy left his family, his home, and everything he knew to travel with Paul, to learn from him and to tell people about Jesus. And so it isn't all that surprising that toward the end of the New Testament, we find 2 letters with Timothy's name on them. Paul's getting older and he knows he's running out of time, so he wants to make sure he's able to pass along to Timothy everything he needs to know before Paul's gone. So with all that in mind, Paul tells Timothy this: don't let anyone look down on you because you are young. Don't let anyone look down on you because you're young, Paul writes, which means that young people were even dealing with this issue thousands of years ago. And not only that, but Paul was a huge authority in the Christian community. So anyone would feel intimidated around him, not just someone who's younger. Now, can't you imagine what it was like to walk around in Paul's shadow? Maybe Timothy was just viewed by others as Paul's assistant or little buddy. We don't know for sure, but it would have been easy to count Timothy as a nobody next to Paul. And it would have been easy for Paul to look down on him too, because Timothy wasn't as big a deal, or wasn't as powerful or commanding or influential. But right away, Paul tells him, nope, being young isn't going to disqualify you from anything. You don't have to put up with people seeing you and discounting you because of your age. You don't have to accept that. That's a great speech, Paul. But how exactly is one supposed to do that? If you've ever had a coach or a teacher who was condescending to people under 30 years old, you know it isn't easy to change their mind. Now, how is Timothy supposed to change how an entire older generation views young people? Don't let anyone look down on you because you are young, but set an example for believers in speech, in life, in love, in faith, and in purity. This is so powerful because what Paul does here is take the power from the older generation, a generation he was part of, and gives it back to the next generation. He's telling Timothy that just because people, especially older people, they view you a certain way, that doesn't mean that you have to play to their expectations. You can prove them wrong. You can tell a different story with your life. When we read this verse, we get the idea that Timothy had to set an example because other people his age weren't doing that great a job with it. In other words, if the older generation had an opinion about Timothy's generation, it was well earned. It wasn't just like the younger crowd had unfairly got a bad reputation. It was that the younger crowd had probably earned that reputation. Maybe you know that feeling. Maybe you feel like you're part of a generation that doesn't get some things right, or you feel lumped in with a crowd that doesn't always seem to make the best decisions. Even though those generalizations don't describe you, you are judged the same as those making poor decisions. If that's you, Paul has a message for you. Paul is saying, don't play into people's expectations. Instead, defy their expectations. In other words, you can refuse to believe that what is said about you is true and choose to do something about it. Every time someone looks down on you, you have an opportunity to change the script about your generation. Paul brings up the same idea again in 2 Timothy. Paul writes, be diligent to present yourself approved to God as a workman who does not need to be ashamed, accurately handling the word of truth. Again, Paul wants Timothy to see how much power he actually has. You do your best, he's saying. You can't control how people view you, but you can do your part to challenge their assumptions by living better. So, great pep talk, Paul. But how are we actually supposed to do this? What does it mean to set an example? What does it mean to be diligent? What do we actually do? we actually do? Well, we start by taking steps. We begin with the small stuff because eventually the small stuff becomes the big stuff. And one of the first steps we can take is to change the dialogue we have in our heads, to change how we view ourselves. This is big. People can start to see us differently once we begin to see ourselves differently. People will be able to value our words when we realize that our words can have value. Have you ever heard the expression, we teach people how to treat us? Basically, this means that the way we behave and the way we carry ourselves sends a message to the world around us. Our words, actions, and behavior tell people who we are and what matters to us. So what if we started to live in a way that says we have something to offer? What if we began to set an example worth following? What if we started to set an example in purity by making wiser choices in our dating relationships, honoring ourselves and others in a way that others take notice? What if we started to set an example in love by getting out of our comfort zone and serving others, even when it's inconvenient? What if we started to set example in our speech? What if instead of talking about other people, we just kept our mouths shut? What if we set an example in faith by allowing our faith to inform every area of our lives? And what if your faith was so noticeable that it inspired the adults in your life? What if we started to set an example in kindness so that every time someone in our families drove us crazy, we changed our tone? We didn't roll our eyes. We didn't slam doors. Listen, I get it. People are always going to have prejudices and opinions about you because you are young, but you don't have to prove them right. You can live in a way that makes people reconsider their opinions about you and even your whole generation. As you leave today, I want you to ask yourself a tough question. What's one thing I do that gives the older generation a reason to look down on young people? And then once you have an answer, ask yourself this. What's one way I could set an example in that area instead? Change is possible. And little by little, you can change the story about your generation. You can be diligent in taking small steps, and you can start today. You are young, but that's not bad. Don't let age define what people think of you. Live in a way that proves them wrong, because you have the potential and the power to increase your influence in your world.